everyone. Welcome. I'm glad you could join us today. I'm Irina Chismash, Head of Marketing at Castify, and your host for this webinar. Exactly 1 month ago, we were sitting in the same formula with, as we are today, with Yedra Williams, former SVP at an EdTech company, but also an advisor for women in customer success, and Saahil Karkera, VP of Customer Success at Oaky. And we started discussing how to prove the value of the CS teams and capture the attention of the leadership team. We tackled your biggest challenges, or at least the ones that you guys mentioned: linking CS to revenue, getting the leadership buy-in, showing CS strategic value, and creating compiling CS stories. And Saahil walked us through their recommendations and how can we navigate those challenges. And we've been discussing about customer journeys, about ICP, time to value, and how can we transform the CS department from a cost center to a revenue center. Definitely 1 hour was not enough. So here we are at part 2. I know that you guys had a lot of questions. I'm sure that you have new ones prepared. So please don't be shy. Throw it to both Saahil and Yedra. You can use the chat function. You can use the question top bottom right of your device. It doesn't matter. I'm going to try to navigate between the conversation and moderating the chat conversation. For those of you who are joining for the first time, we'll record this conversation and we'll send it. Send it to you. We'll try to answer all your questions. But no worries. Even through the conversation or at the end of it in a dedicated Q&A. I also mentioned this last time. This conversation doesn't stop with this webinar. We're going to make sure that we will send you additional resources that hopefully they are tailored to your challenges. If not, feel free to come back and let us know that no, that wasn't clear. We need more. We want to make sure that you have everything that you need to prove internally the crucial role of the CS department. And I have to say that because I know that there are also people from Romania that are watching us. I'm happy to let you know that we will meet in person for the ones that are in Bucharest. If you aren't in Bucharest, but if you still want to join, we are organizing the first in-person event under the umbrella of so we are organizing the Bytes and Bond CS Connect event. Once again, thank you, Saahil, for challenging me and asking me about the Bucharest CS community. That was the impulse that I need to go and research it and basically help organize the first event. I'm super hyped about it. So if you are in Bucharest, if you are not in Bucharest, but if you are in Romania and you want to join, feel free. If you are out of Romania, but still want to join, we are waiting for you on Tuesday, 9th of July at 6:30 p.m. And with this being said, I want to be also mindful with your guys' time, and let's start discussing the things that we have planned for today. And from the challenges that you guys mentioned last time, we didn't discuss about the budget limited one. So I want to kickstart the conversation with this in mind, and I want to pass the question to you, Saahil, because I think that this is something that I see it more prominent in the startup environment, and you've been working with a lot of startups. So how do you deal with limited budget and resources when working in a startup? Is it a curse? Is it a blessing in some cases? What's your take on this?
Yeah, really good question. I think there are a lot of layers to unpack there. I think budget cuts in that sense, or limited budgets, is something that every organization is facing. I think the scope or the magnitude of that indeed is quite a bit more on smaller startups in that sense, Series A, Series B. And that probably also comes because of the fact that they really spend a lot of money acquiring customers, but not so much money or effort to retain those customers. And now, obviously, the board, the investors, the VCs, they're all talking about, hey, where's my money going? What am I supposed to do with all these things with high churn numbers? So yes, that's the pressure coming from the board. CFOs are being educated on the fly, especially in these smaller companies. So what I see as a trend now with a lot of small companies is CFOs educating and learning about what's CAC, what's LTV, what's CAC payback ratio. So that's the one part of it. Is it a curse? Yes, in the short run, I see a lot of roles being made redundant, no backfills. And if there is an opportunity of backfilling, it's in countries where it might not be as expensive to hire. So yeah, it is a stressful situation. A lot of, I think, teams are indeed going through that phase right now. But I do also think this is a time that really represents the biggest opportunity for you to rethink CS, get a lot closer to your customers and really understand what's the experience they're looking from us, what is the value that they want to get from the product, and how do you re-engineer some of those with limited capacities? Because it's never going to be a time where we will have the same big CS teams. So now indeed the question is not just how do you work smart, what is the right thing you should be working on, but how do you do it at scale, right? So I think it really represents a very big opportunity for us in CS to rethink, re-engineer, and reimagine CS.
Do you see AI as a viable solution for startups facing limited resources? Can they effectively implement it, and to what extent to basically deal with the less of budget or with the reduced budget?
I think there's a saying going on everywhere, right? People are worried about AI replacing people. I think AI will never replace a person because you still need empathy. You still need those soft skills, which is very hard to train. But I do think people who will really leverage and get to understand how to use AI, not just in your day-to-day activities, which, for example, could be using something like Update AI or TLDV to send meeting summaries immediately after your meeting. That will also improve customer experience. But also, how do you put that back into the product? So if your product requires it to be populated with data from a third-party source, can you use Gen AI to pull that data from the web and populate your data? So you're shortening your time to launch and hopefully thereby shortening the time to value. So I think leaders will really have to educate themselves about what Gen AI means, get your hands a bit dirty, play around with things. So there is no escaping the fact that you will have to use AI. But again, like a big caveat, don't make that happen at the cost of not focusing on soft skills.
I saw you laughing.
Well, the quote, and I think that Saahil was going to add this, but the quote that I'm hearing, there's variations of it, but the quote is, AI will not replace you. However, someone who uses AI will. And Saahil is like, yeah, I can co-sign to that. So yeah, AI is not going away, but from a productivity standpoint, there are so many gains. And it also ties into employee experience. It also ties into customer experience. So Saahil is spot on. It is here to stay, and we have to leverage it and find ways to make it a value prop for what we're doing from a CS perspective. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think also just to add to what you just mentioned, Deidre, is every platform CSMs are using has started to use AI, right? If you're using Intercom, they recently released Fin, they recently released Copilot. There is no escaping it. So might as well make it a part of your learning strategy to learn and use and leverage this to your best abilities.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like,
Go on.
I was going to say like a practical example of this, right? One of the things I always say is to make your life easier, you need to understand human psychology. And none of us are experts in human psychology. But now you literally have this genie in a box where you can say, hey, using XYZ psychological principles, write me an 8-piece onboarding email cadence. And you iterate from there, right? So you don't need to now rely on copywriters to do that. And that's basically where you really have to start experimenting, learning, and leveraging AI. So there is no escaping it.
I have to give a shout out to one of our attendees because Jay, I see your message. I'm going to read it so everybody can see it. But Jay says, Jay has done a couple of presentations for my team on AI. So Jay is an amazing individual. But it says AI is meant to wash the dishes so we can do art. So what are the dishes I have in CS that I need to be cleaned? I can do that with art. So utilizing AI to wash the dishes from a customer success perspective. Thank you for that, Jay. I appreciate that. And Jay is brilliant, by the way.
And Dula, also in the chat, if you look at what specific things we can leverage AI for, I think that calls for a whole other webinar.
It is another webinar, but I would say that if you want to look at the core of what CS does, at every touch point in the customer journey, you can utilize AI. Onboarding, you can build out, one of the tools that I've been using lately is Zapier. And Zapier allows me to build out workflow so that when I'm trying to develop a customer journey for onboarding, and then when I get into the adoption phase and all the way out into the engagement phase, at every customer touch point on the journey, you can utilize AI tools to help you build out those journeys, build out those frameworks, even build out the success plays so that you can drive value for your customer. So every single touch point in the customer journey, absolutely.
We discussed about the budgets, and I wanna ask you, Didra, because I know that you have more experience on working with bigger teams, but I know that even bigger teams and bigger companies are not immune to this concept of budget cuts. So how do you prioritize what it's mandatory and what it needs to remain? And you, regardless of what we do, this is the minimum that we need. And what do you say? Okay, this can go on a nice to have wishful list. How do you pick what stays and what goes away?
Yeah, the first thing I want to say is that, and I love this question, by the way, so thank you for it, is everyone in customer success should understand the concept of value equity. And what that means is, and Saahil, you alluded to this earlier, is what value does customer success bring to the organization? And from a customer success standpoint, where I've been able to actually avoid, even in the larger as well as the small companies, because I've had the experience in both, where I've been able to avoid the massive budget cuts that you see in some other organizations, is to really focus on two very key revenue drivers. Understanding what our retention metrics look like so that I can prove both to the organization, whether they're public or private, what the revenue looks like. Because we all know this, we've heard this a million times, between 70 to 80% of almost any company, regardless of size, their revenue comes from existing customers. So you need to be able to prove that value equity to either your stakeholders, internally or externally, private or public, what the retention numbers look like. And that's usually looking at something like, what is your average revenue per customer? Okay, so saying how much revenue are you deriving from those customers, and those are existing customers. So that's the first revenue driver. The second one is, how are you growing that customer? Okay, that's the additional value. So are you using CQSLs or customer success qualified leads? Are you expanding within your renewals? Are you continuing to grow your existing footprint with your existing customers? So whenever I'm trying to decide what I keep or what I potentially might have to lose, before I even have that discussion, I want to be able to go to my leadership and say, this is the value equity that customer success provides. These are the revenue retention numbers. This is my revenue growth. And then I'm usually able to either mitigate that budget cut or reduce it, because anything that doesn't lead toward revenue growth and revenue retention, those are the things that I want to take off the table. But anything that increases revenue growth and increases revenue retention, those are the things that I want to keep.
Saahil, do you want to?
I think spot on, very, very well articulated there. What I would love to add is, indeed, if you're operating in a seed stage, Series A, Series B, like I alluded earlier, financial literacy is on the lower end of the spectrum in that sense, right? So if you're a CS leader or an individual contributor in that space, like Deidre mentioned, understand those financial metrics, improve your financial literacy. What is your CAC? Work very closely with your CFO, understand that customer lifetime value. What is your CAC payback period? what's your NRR, and then really start to try and link your day-to-day activities to those metrics, right? Because typically in these smaller companies, the perception of CS is, oh, you guys do support, right? Or you respond to product questions, right? And unless you start talking in these financial metrics and numbers, you'll always be put into that bucket. So you have to kind of take that effort to shift the narrative. So again, in smaller companies, the CFO has a different perception of CS, the CEO, CRO, every team has a different perception. So unless you don't change that narrative, you'll always be put in that bucket. So you're always at the first in the chopping block, if I can put it that way, when it comes to budget cuts. And pretty much like Deirdre mentioned, right? If you can link back these two, hey, is it a revenue growth, a revenue saver? That really gives you so much more information to leverage and shape the story, how it progresses.
No, spot on. And Saahil, I would also add to that, because you're also speaking about it in the same space, is really understanding the literacy part of it. Because I watched the presentation the other day, and the presenter made a comment about how so many customer success leaders fail, unfortunately, at having that financial literacy. Yeah. And I think that if we don't do a better job of understanding those metrics, like you said, NRR, cost of goods sold, but also cost to serve, customer lifetime value. And one I'm going to speak about a little bit later is net present value, because that's how you're going to prevent some of those budget cuts, because you're defining that equity value that I talked about earlier. It's having that financial literacy, to Sahil's point, that is really going to make the difference on our future in customer success.
And just to kind of also add to that, right? Because I don't know the audience in terms of where they are in their customer success journey. You will never have all the data you need to make these numbers up. You have to make a lot of assumptions. You have to start where you are and build and iterate and start cleaning up the data. And I think if you start taking that ownership, the leadership also starts to look at you a lot more differently compared to, hey, you're doing support, right? What I also always recommend is start tracking things at a granular operational level. And what I mean with this, and I can give a very tangible example, is somebody I've been coaching in that person's team. They had to make a few people in customer onboarding redundant, purely because this person only had anecdotal information about how difficult onboarding is, how much time it takes us. But when we could start tracking unit effort to onboard a customer and map that out over the sales trajectory for the next 12 months, we could clearly see that the current team, after redundancy, would be overutilized by 700%. So now the person has a lot more emphasis and leverage to go have a conversation with the management to say, hey, we are overclocking, we need more resources in terms of manpower, or we reduce effort in onboarding by doing PLG in onboarding, so on and so forth, right? So you have to be financially literate. So it's the operational metric and the financial or the monetary metrics. You have to look at both of it.
Speaking about this, one sec, because I think it's and I'm going to pass it to you, Deirdre. Speaking about data, and I also see something posted in the chat by Jay. Data where it didn't happen. I used to work with a CEO who was always telling me, okay, if we have the data, share it with me. If all we have is assumptions, then we would better go with mine. So this is what. That was his approach. So if we have data, okay, good. If not, if all we have is assumptions, then we would better go with mine, because I'm the CEO and I can take it.
And we talked about this in the last podcast. The being a data ninja, really digging down into what data you have access to. And Saahil is spot on. You're never going to have all the data. I mean, I hate to use absolutes, but that would be utopia, and we're not in that world. However, having that financial literacy around what data you need, having access to the people that can get you the right data and can parse it so that you can build out, and we talked about this last time, any type of telemetry reports, cohort reports are something that I rely very heavily on, so I can figure out going back to that ICP. But again, it all needs to tie back to, and Saahil said this earlier, your company's overall goals, regardless of the size of the company, what you're trying to achieve, and then use that data to leverage that equity value, because you're able to prove your point to your internal stakeholders, but you're also able to prove that value to the customer, because you need to have that financial literacy when you're speaking with your customers as well, because it's the language in which they make business decisions.
Let's discuss about let's go into, I would say, specifics, and let the audience know, how do you build a business case for the CS? What are the steps that you guys are taking? How do you basically organize yourselves in building this part? Deidre, let's start with you, and then we'll pass it to Saahil.
Yeah, it's when I'm trying to figure out what value or what that value equity is for customer success, it really goes to net present value. And what that means is looking at what my customer base is, and then trajectorying out from a growth perspective, taking some trend analysis, but also the future value of what those customers are going to bring. And then when I'm able, going back to that number, 80% of our revenue is coming from our existing customers, I can sit down and say, from an ROI perspective, this is the value of our customer base today. This is the potential value that their customer is going to have over their lifetime. So he'll mention this, the lifetime value of that customer. And then I'm able to build out a business case, not only for the value of customer success, but the potential value from a revenue perspective that we're going to be able to bring to an organization. And again, that helps to mitigate the potential budget cuts. It helps to mitigate some of that redundancy that we see. And we talked about it earlier. And it also helps me to retain staff, because from a staffing perspective, if they know the value they can provide, they have greater pride in what they're going to do. But again, that's how we make a decision. Start with what that value equity is, look at what the NPV is, and then build out a case for that and present it to whatever stakeholder you're meeting, whether it's a publicly or privately traded company.
I'm also curious, because we do have some people who are watching us live as we speak. I'm curious, what are your guys' challenges whenever you are trying to build that business case that we're talking? I'm super curious. Drop it in the chat. Maybe some of the things can be picked up by Deidre and Saahil too, and maybe they have some concrete tips for you guys. Let us know, how hard is it in your organization to build a business case? If it's harder, why is that? Do you feel like you have the leadership support? How are those conversations going in your current companies? And Saahil, moving to you, how do you start building the business case?
So I think all the things I would have said any which way. So I think very, very spot on. And it's always, you need to start with the net present value, and then how do you maximize it using the different levers. One of the approaches that has always worked for me very well over the last 8 to 9 years, and that's also what I always tell people, is the first thing as a CS leader you can do is align very closely with your CFO and your CEO. Try and understand what are the company milestones you want to hit over the next 6 months, 12 months, 2 months, and then to really start incorporating that and seeing how can CS deliver on those numbers. So for example, if your CEO tells you, hey, in the next 12 to 18 months, we want to raise Series A. Okay, what does that mean? What financial metrics and numbers are investors going to look at? Okay, they're going to look at retention numbers. Okay, how can CS drive those numbers? Okay, if I need to take a retention number from 85 to 95, I need to run these campaigns. For this, I need these resources, right? So pretty much like Deidre mentioned, start from where you are and then build backwards towards this is how we can bring value and hopefully help you raise a Series A or a B. Because again, with each of these, let's say funding or investment milestones, investors are always looking at one or another metric here and there, right? So if it is Series A, retention for sure is one of the important numbers. But what they're also looking at is, can you scale quickly enough? Can you onboard a volume of customers quickly enough? Okay, that's the area we will focus on, and that's how we will bring and showcase the value of CS to the organization.
No, go ahead, or please.
No, you go on, and then I'll read because Jay shared his view.
I was about to go to that. I'm going to co-sign everything that Saahil just said, but I also was going to pivot to Jay's question. So I don't know if you want to maybe bring it in, or if you want me to bring it in.
Yeah, let's bring it in.
Yeah, Jay, it's a very valid point. I mean, I've had a similar, and to read out to the question for those that aren't seeing it is, I'm just going to sort of hopefully encapsulate it. But at the end of the day, a lot of time leaders aren't listening. I think if I were to summarize it, unfortunately, Saahil is agreeing with me on that. And I've been in that position. But it really goes back to what Saahil just said. We need to make sure that we're speaking in their language. For example, I do a lot of mentoring, and I was coaching one of my mentors to pull a board presentation, and they were still focusing on what I consider customer success 2.0, customer success 3.0, things like adoption, things like sentiment. Those things are interesting and they're important. However, we need to have that financial literacy, and it has to go back to the overall goals and objectives, exactly what Saahil said. If you're talking about things that are not specific to your company, and I'll give you a case in point from my previous position. When I first got to the company as VP of Customer Success, one of my previous roles, my team rolled up into sales. And the metrics that sales was being measured on did not align with the customer success metrics. We really, to Saahil's point, we were really being perceived as that do anything department, as a support entity. However, I said, no, we can do revenue, we can do renewals, we can do retention and growth. And let's make sure that our KPIs and our OKRs are tied to those. But what I did was exactly what Saahil said. I sat down with the CEO and I said, what are you trying to achieve over the next 3 to 5 years? And then let me tell you how, based on what we can do, because I'd already looked at my customer cohorts. I had sat down with the VP of sales and looked at their sales target, and I knew what our trajectory was. So what my team and I said was, based on our existing customer base, because we knew potentially what revenue we could get from them, we were able to determine the potential for the amount of revenue we could provide. That's when the CEO started listening to me. So to answer your question, Jay, making sure that, and it's exactly what Saahil just said, you're speaking in that executive's language, you're using that financial literacy, and you're showing your value equity so that customer success is who they go to from a revenue growth and a revenue retention perspective. I hope that answered your question, Jay. I know you'll tell me if it didn't.
I think he had he also had a follow-up questions. Do you have, and he's asking you if you have those kind of conversations frequently, and what's the cadence to have them?
I will answer that question, but I want Saahil to, if he wants to add anything before I jump into it. So everybody's not just listening to the
could not have articulated that any better than you did, Deidre. So please, you could go.
Okay, well, I will tell you that at the company that I mentioned, I had a weekly cadence with my CEO. And where we went through in a dashboard. I pulled up my dashboards based on the OKRs that I just mentioned. And then once a month, I actually did a presentation to the board. And that board presentation covered 4 metrics. First and foremost, what my team's NRR was to date. It also covered the what we considered customer success qualified leads, or CQLs, the close ratio for those. I also talked about sentiment, because I know I'm probably bemoaning NPS and CSAT, but what I do want the board to be aware of is customer sentiment can impact revenue. So I would present that to the board. And then the last thing is, and Jay, you brought this up, but I would also, one of the metrics that I created as part of my OKR was also my employee engagement numbers and where my employees were from a sentiment. So that was something I actually presented to the board as well, because that is something that is critical. How we treat our CS teams, the motivation of our CS teams is important, because it also drives revenue, and we can have a additional conversation about that. But those are the 4 things: NRR, CQLs, basically from a close ratio, basically what my sentiment was for my my overall customer base, and then more importantly, what I consider customer experience, or employee experience, which is considered EX.
Fantastic points. Just to add from my side, I think this will really depend on organization to organization, right? I think maybe some CEOs will really want to have that pulse, like in the case of Deidre, for example. So they will require weekly updates. Maybe some CEOs like, hey, give me once a month update and I'm fine with it. So there it does, again, really depend on what metrics you speak and what's valuable for the CEO to know, because you, of course, need to look at leading and lagging indicators, right? So I always recommend to propose or come up with one sort of like a balanced scorecard approach that you can publish once a month, once a quarter, that does somehow show progress over a period of time. And essentially also to keep in mind the trend line. Is it looking like an upward trend or a downward trend, right? So from a CEO perspective, what I always think and try to achieve is, can I make this data easy for the person to understand that he can track or she can track my team's progress? Is it upwards or is it trending downwards? But also, again, like I think Deirdre mentioned earlier, to really understand what specific part the board needs us to step up on, right? So if it is onboarding, your time to launch is, let's say, for example, completely off compared to your industry benchmark, then I would add that one specific metric to your balance scorecard. Once you achieve that number, move it away. And maybe send like an internal monthly newsletter to your key stakeholder group, right? You mentioned you report to the head of product. Maybe send one very short summary update to head of product, head of sales, head of marketing, CEO. Get everybody aligned.
I think there's one thing you guys have definitely have the hands-on experience on customer success. What I want to summarize, because Christiana mentioned that she reports to where she used to work someone which background was not financial. He had an engineering background. So I think if you ask me, what's important is to understand your persona, to whom you are reporting, and to understand what are their priorities, for his or her priorities, and understand basically how you can help them. How can I help you from my role? In some cases, where maybe in 90% of the cases, it's all about revenue, it's all about financial metrics, and you and the CEO and the CFO have that financial mindset. But if it isn't, and if it's engineering, then how can I work? If it's a developer's mind, you actually need to understand how do you navigate developers' conversation, and how can you prove what you do. So I think it's also about an ICP and understanding the persona inside and with whom you work.
I'm going to co-sign absolutely on that. And I've been in that. What I will say is, Saahil said something that was critical. It's building out a dashboard that is tied to the individual, particularly within the C-suite. And so, for example, when I talked about those revenue metrics, generally that's the conversation I'm having with the CEO. However, I spent a lot of time talking to the CIO and the CTO in my previous roles as SVP. And one of the things I always did was, from a product perspective, they really want customer feedback, because they're not customer facing generally. And so that customer feedback is usually coming from customer success, and it's a different perspective, but I can still tie it back to revenue, because they have to make product decisions. And oftentimes they're building something that isn't necessarily something that the customer wants. However, if we give them the right insights, they can make product decisions, they can make co-innovation decisions, they can make enhancement decisions based on that particular customer feedback. That generally customer success is the value driver to provide. But more importantly, that does impact revenue, because if product is building products that the customer does not come to, then we do not have product market fit. However, if customer success can give them the insights they need, they can build products, increase revenue, increase retention. So again, it's still tied to revenue. It's just that the items or the data points that are on that dashboard, to Saahil's point, may be different from that VP of product or that CTO, but you still need to make sure that it's still tied to the overall revenue that the company can potentially earn, or more importantly, retain.
Very well nailed it, I would say. And I don't want to, you mentioned the employee sentiment, and I want to stick to that question, because I'm curious, how did you measure it? How did you report on it? How did you pick the data to basically, associate? Or was it a number? Was it a feeling-based thing? How was it? I'm super curious.
No, I was really lucky. In one of my roles, I was able to improve employee satisfaction by 30%. And that was a metric. I put that on as part of my OKRs. And like I said, I reported to the board, because it does impact revenue, and we can drill into that. But one statistic I find incredibly fascinating is 59% of employees are more apt to stay in an organization if they are satisfied. And again, that goes back to revenue, because if you constantly have attrition within your organization, it impacts two things. First and foremost, it impacts morale internally, because the individuals that are left behind are having to do the work for the people that have left. But also it impacts your ability to engage with your customers and build lifetime relationships. So to answer your question about how I measured it, one of the companies I work with, we used a tool called Lattice. And so basically every single one of my direct reports had a Lattice dashboard, and we went into that dashboard on a weekly basis, depending upon what level they reported to me. And this was a small startup, by the way, so I'm not talking about hundreds of employees. But what was beautiful, but it's something that could be scaled. But I knew their sentiment, because at the end of every single week, they actually sent a sentiment report to me. And what it allowed me to do was pivot, because oftentimes you're waiting until a 90 or a 60 or sometimes a 6-month review. And by that time, particularly within customer success, it's too late to course correct for your employees. But on a weekly basis, I could sit down with my team and literally it's a smiley face emoji. And if I didn't get a smiley face emoji from everybody across my team, I knew that something was wrong, because the individuals that were not giving me a smiley face emoji, we all love emojis, then I knew I had to sit down with that individual and figure out what was going on. But I really focused on 3 things with my teams, and I call them the 3 C's. It's a clear understanding of what their motivations are, because we're all motivated by different things. The second C is clear communication. And Saahil, you kind of touched on this when you were talking about teams, is making sure I communicate what their leadership, either myself or their if they're reporting to someone else, what metrics they're being graded on and why. And then more importantly, a clear path for success. How do they succeed in their role, and how can I enable to do that? So the 3 C's: clear communication, clear metrics, and a clear path to success. And then utilizing tools, like I said, a tool like Lattice or other employee resource tools, so that I can measure what their sentiment is over time, as opposed to doing it on, in some cases, a time frame that's a lagging indicator, to Sahil's point, using it from an employee sentiment standpoint. But I hope that answered your question.
No, brilliant, spot on. I wouldn't add anything more there. I do think the space we are in now, with all the changes happening in general, and if you're in a smaller company, maybe that feels a lot more frequent. I always say clarity equal to speed. And as a leader, you really have to be clear in terms of what is a priority, because in startups, today something is a priority, tomorrow it's not. And bringing that clarity to your team in terms of what's important really helps with the speed of execution. And I think Jay also mentioned in the chat, it's about engaging with your team on a regular basis that really shows them you're engaged. But I do also think, and I sometimes empathize with middle managers in that sense, they are sort of getting crushed by the board and the team that they manage, right? Because they have to manage expectations on both sides. What always works for me is to go for a walk around the block. Because for me, it's just something of walking next to a person in an open environment that does something psychologically where you just open up a lot more. So I really make sure that once every month we go for a walk around the block, that indeed throughout that month, you're engaging with them at a different level, right? You're having your weekly team meetings. I always have a bi-weekly portfolio review meeting with the CS team. And outside of the walk around the block, there's one meeting around your career growth. So you have to engage with people across different layers, but also tell them, hey, this is your space to talk about your pain points and challenges, but also give feedback to your leader. So I expect my team to be brutally honest with me, saying, hey, you're being very unclear. You're being very demanding right now. You are coming up with way too many initiatives. Can we stop this? So I think it sort of really goes both ways. And I do genuinely hope for the audience here, you have open managers like that as well, right? And if not, it's always my recommendation to open up that conversation. At the end of the day, we are all humans. We are empathetic people. I would like to say most CS people are. I hope your leader takes that as a good positive feedback.
Again, I can co-sign everything Saahil just said, and obviously said it brilliantly. I would also agree that reflective feedback is so critical as a leader, because I have learned so many from the individuals that have reported to me from not only the sentiment tracking that I do through either a tool or just on a personal one-on-one, to Saahil's point, but also it's interesting that you talk about that, because one of the things that the CEO that I reported to, once a month, he would take us for a walk. And he would get his entire executive team, and we would all just walk for an hour. And what was interesting was it was an informal, there's no PowerPoint presentation, there's no dialogue around metrics. It was really a way for all of us to sometimes have those informal conversations that are difficult within an office setting. However, if you're walking in a beautiful park, or if you're in a setting where you can engage with nature, which is what he usually tended to do, it was, for us, because a lot of us were new in our roles because it was a startup, but I can say those were some of the most valuable conversations that we had outside of the board presentations that we all had to do, or sometimes our weekly conversations as leaders. So I love that walk around the block, and it's something that would be very, very helpful. And also that what I would consider reflexive feedback.
Yeah. And just to also add there, I remember reading this somewhere. I don't remember from where it was, but it's this thing where when you're having a meeting with someone, I always try my best to sit next to them, because just sitting across from each other does something where it just feels like a very interrogative setup. So 90% of my one-on-ones conversation with my team members is sitting next to them. It just does something psychologically. I don't know what it is, but it does something.
So now speak to that if you're in a virtual environment, because there's so many individuals, and I'm seeing some of that coming up in the chat, that are working. How do you create that side by side in a virtual environment? Not to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious.
It's a really good question. I think
because I love the ideal, and I do it, but I work remotely for like the last 15 years, so it's rare that I have an in-office one-on-one.
Yeah, so I think what we've done at Oaky is, and this was at the height of the pandemic period, right? Which is 2 years ago. We've kind of taken some of those habits even now. A major part of our meeting, in the first part of it, is all about small talk. It might feel very awkward, but it is small talk. We have to do this. So like, I hope my team will not watch this before next week's meeting. But the idea is the next week's meeting, we're all going to put on these Google Meet, the masks that you get, or the filters of like these funny animals, just to keep it light as well and keep it engaging, So you have to think of these fun activities. I know like the team that we have in Kuala Lumpur, they have a virtual breakfast together. Mm-hmm. Or once a month virtual lunch together. So you have to create those in-person coffee moments, but then virtually as well.
I love that. What my team did was we had Friday Fabulous. Yeah. And so every Friday, and again, this was a small startup, so there were probably, when I was there, it was about 50 of us, so it was relatively small. And on Friday Fabulous, all of the respective teams, whether it was product or customer success, we all jumped on a call and we talked about what we did that week. And so what my team, we called ourselves the Guardians of the Galaxy. And because I'm a big MCU fan. And so every single individual on my team assumed a Guardian of the Galaxy persona. And we would do cosplay or anything around dressing up in those particular personas. And we would do our presentation as those characters. So there is some fun. There are fun ways to engage and motivate the team. And that was one of them. Okay, I'm sorry, Irina. We totally digressed.
No worries. I want to go back. I want to go back to, you actually addressed how do you keep your team motivated, and it's nice that we basically ended up. I had it prepared for you, and somehow you asked that question without me. You answered the questions without me asking. I wanna go back to the revenue part and the business case part, and. I think regardless of how well we are prepared, there's always a level of skeptical things, or skeptical leaders. So I wanna ask you, how do you communicate the ROI results to those skeptical leaders? Especially if I told you the joke with if all we have is assumptions, we would better go with mine because I'm the CEO. So how do you navigate those tough conversation where the CEO puts the CEO hat and says, regardless of your assumptions, I know better. So how do you? It's a tough and I would say demotivating thing for a person, but. I want to help the audience prepare for those conversations as well.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I've had them. I think the most interesting conversation was I worked with the CTO at a startup once, and I remember in our weekly one-on-one, he started the call off by saying, "I owe you an apology." And I thought, okay, I don't recall. Yeah, he started the conversation off like that, and I was like, "Oh, which way does this go?" And it goes back to something that Saahil said. At that point, I'd been with the company for a few months, coming in as a new VP, and my team and I had worked very hard to provide clarity around what customer success was. It was a strategic, proactive, value-driven organization. That was our mantra. And it actually was part of any presentation we ever presented, both internally and externally. And we thought we were doing a really good job. We had improved customer engagement by 40%. We had gotten it to the point where we had become a trusted advisor to our customers, to the point where they were coming to us to do QBRs. You guys heard me talk about core meetings. Customers were coming to us saying, when is our next customer objective meeting, which is similar to a QBR. But what we had not done a very good job, at least in the CTO's mind, is really articulating what customer success was in the organization. And that was an epic fail for me as the CS leader. But what he was apologizing for is he knew that we had done all of this externally, and he really had not listened to any of it, to his credit. Even though we'd done it externally, he participated in like I said, we had the Friday Fabulous. He was on those calls, so he knew what we were doing. But what we had not done was sit down with he and his team on a regular basis and talk about what we were doing for them. And so what I started doing was, when they started objecting to some of the things my team wanted to do, I sat down with him after this apology and I said, "Tell me what you think my team does." And he said all those things that Saahil said. No, you guys handle support tickets and you deal with escalations and you're just all about making the customer happy. And I said, first off, there's another organization that does that. It's called support. And we're not that. Because he thought CS meant customer support. So you've been there. So what I did was I said, let's step back and let me explain to you, based on the conversations that I've had with our CEO, what customer success does. And then I was able, using the data, using value metrics, okay, that made sense for the CTO, to say, this is the value that we provide internally, and this is the value we can provide to your respective teams. After that, he went to the CEO, and I'll never forget this. On one of our Friday Fabulous calls, our CEO said to the entire company, he said, "Deidre's team is not customer support." My Slack channel blew up. My entire team was like, "That is amazing. He said that." But more importantly, it provided clarity for everyone. And some of the things that they were wanting to do, there were members on my team that they were wanting to, make redundant. Unfortunately, there were cuts that they wanted to provide to my team. But after these conversations, a lot of that noise went away, because I was able to clearly articulate, using the data, using the language that's appropriate for this individual, so that he was able to advocate on my behalf to the CEO. And I was able to mitigate some of the possible cuts that we were going to have. But it was really about really having clarity around who we were and what we did. That was how I overcame that particular objective. I hope that makes sense.
Saahil, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I'm going to take a bit of a different tangent on this. Yep. By the way, I completely agree with what Deidre mentioned, right? It's always about showing with numbers what you do and what you can potentially achieve. I also always think every team in the best interest always thinks that they are the center of the business, right? That they are the ones doing everything. I do sometimes feel CS, we are in our own little bubble. So like pretty much Deidre mentioned, it's also about collaboration. It's about talking to them about metrics that matter to them, and how do you create that symphony and synergy between the two teams. But it's also hard, just because we in CS understand the importance of CS doesn't mean everybody gets it. And it's tough. It is your job to educate them. In some cases, people will get it. In some cases, it'll take you a few weeks, few months, maybe even a year before they do actually get it. But that's the mindset part that you should not give up. And again, using the metrics and numbers like Deidre mentioned, right? And speaking to them in their language, that eventually will shift and change that narrative. So there is no silver bullet to this. There isn't like one metric, one number that you can say, and all of a sudden, and be like, aha, that's what you do. It's impossible.
And it's hereditary. You keep having to say it. You keep having to. That's the thing that is somewhat challenging for my teams and myself as a CS leader. Is it's never a one and done. It's a iterative process. You have to pivot. You have to be agile, but you have to keep saying it over and over. So exactly what spot on. Exactly what Saahil said.
I have one more question now for you both. I'm curious. You have different experience. You've interacted with different type of companies. What were the common, I would say, obstacles? Were the common, how do you mean, objections? Whenever you were presenting the business cases, regardless of all the data and regardless of how well prepared you were coming into a meeting, I think there are situations in which there's always one question that you didn't come prepared to, or you didn't think about it. What were those? Or what were your common challenges? Saahil, let's start with
Saahil, and you go with you.
Yeah, I would genuinely say, like, early on in my career, not being in sync with my sales counterpart, right? Because at the end of the day, the CFO looks at this from one company revenue financial model perspective. So you can't have a completely different story compared to your sales counterpart, right? So that was one of the genuine mistakes I did it early on in my career. So indeed, then the CFO would ask, okay, but then how does this track and overlay compared to the sales projections? And I'm like, oh yeah, that's actually a very good question. I have no idea. And there you go, right? Your whole plan fell apart. So now you need to go and rebuild stuff. And indeed, things like, okay, what's your unit effort to onboard a customer? Why are you asking for these additional resources? So these have been like very painful learnings over the years that you really have to, if you're asking for $1, think about all the ways and why you need that one single dollar, and then speak from that perspective, right? So that was like my learnings from the past, that I would just come up with these numbers, and when the CFO starts to poke holes, you're like, right, it's a lot of holes in there. I'm going to go back to the drawing board, come back.
No, again, spot on, co-signing on all of that. I would say a similar variation is the thing that I heard constantly, and a lot of times it was coming from sales, Saahil, is that customer success is COGS. That's all we are. We are not a profit center. We are not a revenue generator. And sales owns the customer and you do not. And what I had to learn was sitting down with VP of sales, sitting down with the CRO, who I reported to directly in my previous role as SVP, and saying, well, actually, we are not just COGS. Okay, we're not just a line item on a P&L. We can own a P&L. And more importantly, we can generate revenue. And then being able to demonstrate how we generate that revenue. And it goes back to something I said earlier, sitting down with the VP of sales or the CRO and the CEO in some cases and saying, this is the average revenue per customer that my team generates currently. And then looking at the customer lifetime value, looking at that NPV and saying, over the lifetime, this is the trajectory potentially of how much additional revenue, and then using statistics to say that for the most part, if you look at a customer success qualified lead, it has an 80% conversion rate versus a marketing qualified lead, which has a 2 to 3% conversion rate. You don't need to be a rocket science to say, if I go with a customer success lead, the sales cycle will be shorter, the retention rate will be higher, and the average revenue will be much greater than if I'm going with just a marketing generated lead. So that's one of the things that I've used to overcome those objectives, but it tends to be an objective around all you guys are is a line item on a cost sheet. And I have to constantly sit down with leadership and say, no, we're not. There is an ROI. We do drive value, and we can be successful within your organization.
Yeah, I think just to also add to what Deirdre mentioned, right? I think not necessarily everything can be measured so tangibly. I think it's also sometimes feedback that you're passing along to your sales colleague, like, hey, we are hearing this from the market. Incorporate that into your qualification questions, or this is what we hear from ICP. So, hey, marketing team, sharpen your value proposition. So And I don't know how you could put like a number or a metric to it, but that's something you can always speak to. But that's again where you have to really closely align with your GTM counterparts, your product counterparts, right?
You're spot on. It's not always a quantitative metric. It sometimes is a qualitative metric. But I think that one of the most valuable insights that customer success can provide throughout the organization is that feedback loop. And that feedback can go to the product team. It can go to the sales team. And you cannot always quantify it, but you can qualify it when you look at the product decisions that are made based on customer feedback. Or if you're looking at sales cycles and sales frameworks and sales decisions that are made on customer feedback. Again, there can be a through line to a revenue metric, but it isn't always a one-for-one quantitative metric. But you're spot on, yes, as always.
Guys, it looks like we covered almost all the questions, or at least the ones that were actually addressed through the conversation, the ones that I have prepared for both of you. So I think we can call it a day. Of course, that doesn't mean the conversation stops here. Actually, far from it. We want to stay in touch. We're gonna keep discussing through different channels. A big thank you to both of you, Deidre and Saahil, for your valuable insights, and actually to everyone who contributed to this conversation and to everyone who participated in today's webinar. And what can I say? Until next time, take care and have a great day, everyone. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Thank you, Saahil.
Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
Irina. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.